Hi everyone, and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Jessica, one of the store's booksellers. Thank you for joining us in this new format where we continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button below to purchase the book on PMP's website. Our physical stores are closed, and your online purchases are needed in order to keep bringing you the programming PMP is known for. Another way to support PMP tonight is using the donate button at the bottom of your screens and contributing whatever you are able. Tonight, you can ask the author a question by clicking on the Ask a Question button, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. You can also read other people's questions and vote for the ones you'd like to hear answered the most. Finally, we want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. We are so thankful for our family loyal customers and for keeping our business and our spirits afloat. We are thrilled to welcome Jia Lynn Yang, author of One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, to PMP Live. She documents 4 decades of American immigration, legislation, and reform. Yang's well-researched and comprehensive record of a crucial period in the evolution of U.S. immigration policies sheds light on the political, cultural, and historical considerations on this issue. Tonight, she will be in conversation with Robert Sy, a professor of law at American University and an expert in constitutional law, American politics, and history. He is the author of Practical Equality: Forging Justice in a Divided Nation. It is my pleasure to welcome Jia Lynn Yang and Robert Sy to PMP Live.
Hi, Jia Lynn. How are you?
Great. It's so wonderful to be here.
It's great to be with you as well. Before we get started, I should just say that, welcome to the DC Literati. What I'm referring to, of course, is a piece that Jia Lynn wrote when she was in high school about Politics and Prose bookstore. And I've got to say, you were a hard-hitting journalist already back then. I'm going to quote your words back to you from the piece that you wrote about Politics and Prose. Quote, Politics and Prose is enjoying its success as the 1999 Publishers Weekly Bookseller of the Year. This past year, Crown Books filed for bankruptcy. Amazing, amazing. Okay, well, as I said before, it's really a pleasure to be able to read this beautifully written book, to think hard about it, and to be able to have this conversation with you. We both have personal and professional interests in the subject. Both of our families came from Taiwan, and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to call ourselves Americans if the laws hadn't changed over the years. You've written a vivid, eminently readable political history about immigration, roughly between the years of 1925 and 1965. Your narrative is bookended by 2 of the most important immigration laws: the Immigration Act of 1924, signed by President Calvin Coolidge, and then the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. Along the way, you offer an incredibly accessible account of the major figures involved in changes to immigration law over the years, as well as the ideas on both sides of the debate. So let me begin by asking you, how did you exactly get interested in writing a book about immigration?
I really stumbled into this whole idea. I happened to be in Austin for a friend's wedding and had time to go to the LBJ Museum. And I've long loved reading histories of the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society, and just have always been fascinated by this period of just intense legislation and political movement. And so went to the museum and was loving it, and happened to walk into a room that basically has all of the accomplishments of the Great Society under Johnson. So everything from starting, the Public Broadcasting Corporation to Medicare, Medicaid, the big highlights that we've all heard of. And there was one corner of the room that mentioned this immigration law from 1965 that I admittedly had never really heard of. And it just said in the line below it, and this law accounts for why there's so many Asian Americans and Latin Americans in the US now. And I thought, I wonder if this law is connected to my family, because my family came here after 1965. So I went home and started kind of searching and looking around, and sure enough, and asking my parents, asking my family, like, do you know about this law? Questions that I'd never asked before, because I just had kind of assumed we're immigrants. This is a nation of immigrants. Of course, my family was allowed to come. But the more I dug into the story, the more I realized this was a potentially really fascinating kind of political excavation tied to family history and a way of connecting my family's history to this country's history. And the people involved, presidents that I'd heard of, people I hadn't heard of, all together could make an interesting book.
Now, speaking of the people who've had an impact on immigration law, there's a number of them in your book. People and groups from Lyndon B. Johnson to John F. Kennedy. You write about many of them, primarily about those in political power, like presidents and legislators and their aides. You pick someone to start the book with, and you carry him through most of your book, and his name is Manny Seller from Brooklyn. Why does he seem to be the hero of your story?
He's one of these congressmen that used to be really famous, but people have sort of forgotten. He's in the House of Representatives for like nearly 50 years. He starts out when Harding is president and isn't gone until Nixon is president. And for a lot of the 60s, and during this huge period of legislation, he's running the House Judiciary Committee. So every single major piece of legislation from the Great Society runs through him. And I picked him because when he joins Congress in the 20s as a young man, he's the grandson of German Jewish immigrants. His constituents are all European immigrants. And he is horrified when Congress passes these ethnic quotas in 1924, which is where my book begins. And these quotas single out Eastern Europeans, Jews, Italian immigrants as people that the country doesn't want. And Manny Seller is really outraged by this. He finds it to be totally unjust, racially discriminatory, and he spends the next 40 years literally trying to undo these quotas and doesn't quite make it until 1965. So his whole career, much of it he spends exactly on this issue.
You do a magnificent job carrying him all the way through your book. I've been meaning to ask you, though, was there anyone that got left out of your book that you initially wanted to have in there? Anybody you left on the cutting room floor, so to speak?
I mean, I think one thing that I found interesting is that the book, to understand 1965, right? So this is a law that says we cannot discriminate immigrants based on their race or ethnicity, and it's abolishing this 1924 law that set out these ethnic quotas. And it's really a story of European immigration. It's because all of America's past is about European immigration. I think there were parts of Asian immigration that I would have dug into even more. It's certainly part of the story and it's in the book. So if you're trying to understand my family's from Asia, why are we here? The book certainly answers that. But there are sort of smaller battles around immigration from India, immigration from China that I get into. But, in another book, you could imagine getting into it even more. It's a lot of ground to cover for 40 years.
It is. It's true. Let's talk a little bit more about that 1924 law. Which has actually made something of a comeback with the current administration. Immigration restrictionists such as Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, Steve Bannon when he was around, they all love it. Tell us why.
So I think this history is especially important because it's the history that the Trump administration is working off of. So 1924 is just this pivotal law. Before this law, we don't have visas in our immigration system. It's quite open. If you make it to Ellis Island, if you make it to Angel Island, you're basically in. You don't need to have paperwork. There are no numerical limits. You can just show up. There's a literacy test that's passed in 1917, but pretty much everyone who wants to come and makes it physically to the port can get in. And what happens is that, for some of you in the audience, perhaps, there's this huge wave of historic immigration. Many, many, many Eastern European Jews and Italians come between 1880 and 1920. And they transform cities like New York overnight. And there are people who get very worried about all these immigrants coming in and changing the country in ways that they don't want the country to be changed. They basically say, America is a white Anglo-Saxon nation. All these Jews and Italians are coming in and they're changing our country much too quickly. We've got to restrict them. So in 1924, they passed these quotas that literally rank ethnicities and races and say, these are desirable, these are not. So they say Northern and Western Europe, that's desirable. But we don't want people from Eastern Europe, we don't want Southern Europeans, and we definitely don't want Asians. And so once that happens, this whole notion of the country being a melting pot or a place, the Emma Lazarus poem, right? The bring me your huddled masses, that really dies. That whole notion really just kind of ends because the country says, we just can't take in more immigrants. We've got to keep our white Anglo-Saxon nature intact. And, and overnight, immigration plummets, the percentage of foreign born goes down to the single digits. The idea of immigrants being a big part of the fabric of the country really kind of begins to fade, and it feels like a thing of the past.
Now, in your book, you point out that America's 1924 immigration law actually becomes popular in some other countries like Nazi Germany. James Whitman, legal historian, made a similar point. Tell us why that 1924 law becomes so popular in some other places.
So when the US passes this law, Hitler literally takes notice and says, look, this country knows what it's doing. It's really affirming and defending itself as a white nation. This is ethnic nationalism. This is the idea that the way to define America or a country at all is by race. And this 1924 law is really kind of like a high point for that argument. And so I think these days when we talk about immigration, you can see this with the Trump administration, right? This whole discussion of do we pick certain countries as more preferable than others? What do we want to define our country as? And 1924 is saying very affirmatively, it's a white nation and we have to keep it that way. And that's why people like Hitler, admire it.
Speaking of notions of America, because I think you're absolutely right that immigration law does have the distinction of sort of forcing us to think about what the nature of our community really ought to look like and be about. And one of the things you point out in the book is a metaphor that many of us who've grown up here in the United States are familiar with, and that's the melting pot metaphor. A different one has always appealed to me, which is that of the stew. You and I talked about this before. But there's yet another one, which you talk about in your book, which is an alternative of America as a symphony. So I wonder if you have your own views about which you prefer.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think one thing that I really learned about from doing the book is sort of breaking down what does this word assimilation really mean? So if you think about the melting pot metaphor, which I grew up hearing all the time in school, and it's still invoked, you still hear it, comes from a play from the early 1900s by a British Israeli playwright. And he's celebrating America as a place where all these European immigrants come and put together and melded together, they create one new race. And I think that idea of assimilation, which people like Henry Ford really got into, it really is kind of predicated on this notion that all these Europeans come and mixed together, they create kind of a new version of being white, essentially. And so there's something very uniform about what everyone is becoming. And I think the more our country changes, right? So the 65 law I'm so interested in because, and we'll talk about this later, but it invites so many non-Europeans to come. But I think this melting pot metaphor, which I think is a model for assimilation that says assimilation is becoming more like a white American, gets harder to kind of work with because we have people from around the world now, and you can't so easily just say, these are some Europeans and put together, it'll be one sort of mishmash of European races. We have people from every country in the world now. What does that assimilation look like? So another metaphor, as you mentioned, there's a sociologist named Horace Kalin who basically says it should be more like a symphony. So you have different cultures pulling in together and playing together, they make something new, but you don't have to make everyone kind of fit one mold. I think that's closer to where we are right now, but I think we just, as a country, I don't think we've really talked about it. These debates around whether people need to learn English, things like this are all about assimilation and becoming American. And again, this basic question of what makes someone American. And, what do we as a community, how do we decide that?
I'm speaking to Jia Lynn Yang about her new book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. I hope you have some questions out there for her. If you do, there's a little box down below, hit that button, ask your question, and in about 20 minutes or so, we'll go through those and we'll get Jia Lynn to answer your questions. This month is Asian American Heritage Month, and we would be remiss if we did not spend a few moments talking about how immigration law has affected migration patterns to the United States from different parts of Asia. maybe the best way to get into this is just give us a sense of what you believe to be immigration law in the United States in the early years, but sort of right before this period that you write about.
You know, this is the most important law to understand. Earlier period from my book, but really foundational, is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first federal law that singles out an ethnic group for restriction for immigration, and it bans all Chinese laborers. And it begins to kind of set this tone. Before that, it's truly open borders. Beginning with that law, that begins to change. And that law also, I would add, bans the naturalization of Chinese immigrants to becoming American citizens. So for much of the country's history in the 20th century, Asian immigrants could not naturalize and become citizens. And very few of them could even come, which I was kind of, you know, given how Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group now, this was sort of stunning to me. And this question of like, well, how did we get from banning Chinese laborers to having all these Chinese immigrants and people from all around Asia? You know, in 1924, they ban even more Asians, right? So Chinese are banned. In 1924, they say, if you can't, it's a funny language. They basically say, if you can't naturalize, you can't immigrate. And there's a Supreme Court case during this time, anyone who's interested, where a Japanese immigrant tries to naturalize and he says, I want to become an American. And the Supreme Court looks at his case and says, well, we, in our laws, only freed whites and freed Black slaves essentially can naturalize. So you are neither and you cannot naturalize. So again, for many, many years, Asian immigrants couldn't even naturalize. That changes in the 50s, and then the 65 law allows many, many more Asian immigrants to come. But the book really deals with that fight that, you know, I at least personally sort of took for granted that like Asian immigrants could come and people like my parents could naturalize, but that all changes during this period of time as well.
Now, one of the, I think, fascinating themes of your book, and you did a great job of sort of extricating this from the broader narrative, is that immigration politics can often make for strange bedfellows. And there's a part of your book that really stood out to me where during the debate over changes that are enacted in 1952, this debate pits sort of Japanese American activists against those who wanted broader, sort of more egalitarian changes. Tell us a little bit more about that moment, if you would.
So, you know, in 1924, they passed these strict ethnic quotas. And in 1952, you know, 30 years later is the next chance to look at big immigration reform, a whole overhaul of the system. And all the opponents of the quotas come out and say, okay, now's the time to get rid of the quotas. And in the middle of this fight are Japanese Americans. And I found their story just completely fascinating. There's a man named Mike Masaoka, who's born in the US, parents are Japanese immigrants, grows up in Utah, very, very white community of Mormons. And his family ends up being placed in the internment camps during World War II. These are the horrifying camps that FDR signs an executive order and places all these Japanese American families overnight in, right, on the West Coast. And Mike Masaoka is part of this group called the Japanese American Citizens League that quickly launches into action and tries to become kind of a liaison between the Japanese community and the Pentagon, essentially, and Washington. And no one's really elected them to do this, but they sort of bring it upon themselves. And they take this very, I think, controversial stance, which is they say, well, we really need to cooperate. We need to prove that we're loyal Americans. And so they both encourage people to go along with the camps, but then they also say, let's volunteer and fight in the war. Let's die for our country. And Mike Masaoka helps to form the 442nd Regiment, which is this famous, very highly decorated unit. Many Japanese Americans die in World War II, and he comes back, and it's the 1952 immigration fight, and he's like, okay, we've sacrificed so much. Give us the right to naturalize. Give us the right to immigrate. You banned us in 1924. Let us in. People like my mom are elderly. I want her to be able to naturalize and die an American citizen. And when they get to this fight, they are, in theory, allied with Jewish Americans who want to get rid of the quotas. They should be allied with Black Caribbean immigrants who are also affected by these quotas and with this immigration law. But essentially, they're sort of horse trading during this debate. And the lawmakers basically say, like, we can't get rid of the quotas, but we can let Asians naturalize. We can allow more of them to immigrate. And Mike Masaoka basically takes that compromise, kind of abandons the others who are trying to end the quotas, and wins naturalization rights for Asian Americans, which to me is so fascinating. That is a watershed moment in Asian American history, right? Without the sacrifices of those Japanese American soldiers, without Mike Masaoka's lobbying, you know, many of our families would not have had the right to naturalize. And yet in that moment, he really kind of tosses overboard. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. The Jewish American groups are like, they ruined the whole thing. They walked away and they kind of devastated us. And it's just a really interesting moment where all these immigrant groups want sort of the same thing, but then end up kind of looking out for themselves too.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating moment for many of the reasons you sort of just explained. It's fascinating because, you know, something ultimately good comes out of the law. And if it didn't come out then, it you know, surely wouldn't have come out for another 13, 14, 15 years at the earliest. And there was frustration in the breakdown of the coalition. But as you sort of point out, and we won't tell the full story because we want people to read your book, in the long run, that frustration on the part of egalitarians and other ethnic groups, still frustrated with the quotas, ends up not leading them to give up, but rather to kind of engage in more activism, and leading to the 65 changes. So I guess that's the sort of silver lining in all of that. Now, as you talk about in your book, you know, the big changes happened in 1965 that really make it possible for a lot of families like ours to come to the United States. Why is that exactly? What is it about the 1965 changes that really opens things up for this tide that you've talked about?
So one thing I will say that struck me throughout all this research was how often foreign policy is an issue. So a lot of this is happening with the Cold War, and essentially it's lawmakers and leaders saying, okay, we're fighting the Cold War. It's an ideological battle. We have to have immigration laws that aren't racially discriminatory, just as we have to get rid of Jim Crow laws. It's just not a good look to have the moral high ground and have these laws. And so they passed this law in 65 for that and other reasons. And what's so fascinating is that they get rid of the quotas, but then they have to say, okay, well then what do we replace them with? If we're not going to rank people based on race, how do we decide who gets in and who doesn't? And this is, as we know now, always a really complicated question and one without easy answers. And in sort of the horse trading to get to passage, they begin debating, okay, so we could talk about, you know, some people should have special job skills. We want that kind of person. That's something that the Trump administration now says they want. They want those immigrants. Others say, well, what about people with family ties, right? If you already have someone here, your brother, your sister, your mom, your, you know, someone in your direct family, you can come. And what's fascinating is that in this sort of jockeying and compromising that LBJ is in the middle of, and of course he's this, you know, master manipulator and cajoler of lawmakers, is that there's some nervousness from people who want to keep the country white about getting rid of the quotas. And so they say, well, maybe the way to keep the country white, you know, still is to prioritize families being together. So there aren't that many, you know, non-European immigrants in the country. So they figure if there aren't that many here, and if we just allow some brothers and sisters to come, that's not going to change the ethnic makeup that much. But what we learn as a country after that, and in the decades since, is that family reunification, or as, you know, conservative critics call it, chain migration, is what leads directly to so many Asian Americans being here, so many people from around the world, people in my own family, you know, perhaps some of you in the audience. It explains why the country changes demographically so dramatically. And, you know, it's like no one anticipated that there would be this many Asian immigrants, people from Latin America. And part of that is because different presidents keep admitting different refugee groups as part of the Cold War. So Cubans come, Vietnamese come, and over time, every time a group comes, right, they suddenly can get green cards for their family members, and then that person comes and naturalizes. Then they bring in more family, and like that's why all of us are here. And that is, for me, like one reason why this book is so relevant to now, is that you always hearing about the Trump administration talking about chain migration. All these people are here, and this fight, this law, is where all of that comes from.
Speaking of the Cold War and how the rhetoric in the debate of immigration has changed over the years, I think it would be fun to give readers just a little bit of a taste of how that debate has changed. Certainly post 45. The early part of your book focused on a lot of the arguments that we're familiar with, things like arguments about the economy, certainly about the extent to which peoplehood should be connected to race or ethnicity. But with Truman so let me back up just a little bit. Certainly in the 30s and 40s, we start to see the impact of something you mentioned earlier, which is the Holocaust affecting how people are starting to debate immigration. And eventually after 45, we see the Cold War starting to have a huge impact on the way both sides are talking about the question. I think one of the things that readers will be really fascinated with is the role of Truman, because I think that your book does a wonderful job kind of explicating how Truman sort of gets involved in all of this. Give us a little taste of that. One or two things that Truman did that perhaps readers will be surprised by.
So when Truman becomes president, it's because FDR suddenly dies of a heart attack, and he's president. And what we learn as a country from World War II is that these quotas that were passed in the 20s during a very isolationist period really prevent the country from admitting refugees from the Holocaust. During the war, it's just, it's completely tragic, because these quotas, as I mentioned before, limit specifically immigration from Eastern Europe. And so all these Jewish refugees trying to come can't come because of these quotas. And when the war is over, the refugee problem just explodes, right? It's sort of like right now we have this global refugee problem. Same thing happened after World War II. And Truman is sort of looking at this, and he says, we fought this war for moral reasons. How can we now, at the end of this, not try to help these refugees? And he gets involved with trying to figure out Israel, right, as a potential place for refugees to go. And then he begins to look at America's immigration laws and says, these don't make sense. They aren't helping us advance our foreign policy interests, our moral interests, right? If we are moral global actors now after this war, we have to be able to allow refugees. So Truman is really the first president in this country to establish refugee laws. So the laws that we think of now, where you have to have a group sponsoring a refugee coming, that is something that comes out of Truman's work in 1948, passing the first kind of big refugee law and act. And he kind of builds on that. And as they're doing more and more of that, more people begin to question these quotas. So I think of Truman as a really critical kind of link between 24 and 65 and understanding, how do these quotas, why do people get rid of them? And someone like Truman is a really powerful voice against them. Even though it's very hard to get rid of them and they keep losing in the 50s, he keeps trying, and he's really morally driven from the lessons of the Holocaust and the refugee crisis after the war.
There seems to be something new that comes up too during this period that you talk about, which is we might call the argument one of ideological incompatibility. Whereas earlier we saw many more arguments about people with certain cultures or religions or races or ethnicities that might be incompatible with the notion of America. We start to see arguments about how people who have certain political values, they're communists or they live in communist countries, are not the kind of people that we might want to have in the United States. On the other hand, we see that rights and freedoms for anyone oppressed by communists or willing to fight against communists are being used by the other side, the sort of reform side of things. Is that the way you see it, or do you see it as a little bit more complicated than that?
I mean, I think in the whole history of it, you see a lot of anti-immigration sentiment is mixed up with other things. There's a lot of kind of anti-radical, anti-labor, all of anti-left. It's kind of mixed together because there's this sense that these immigrants who are coming, this happens in the 20s and again in the 50s, are radicals. They're potential subversive elements, even spies in the 50s. And so when people, again, argue, people like Truman are arguing in the 50s, okay, let's get rid of these quotas. Like, they don't make any sense. They're, I didn't even get into this, but they're based literally in eugenics, like Hitler liked them. Why are we doing this? This is at the moment of really, really peak anti-communist McCarthyism. And so there's a lot of resistance to this idea that we should let in immigrants, because people say, well, who knows? They're coming in, they're going to bring in these subversive ideas, they're going to overthrow the American government. Now is not the time to be loosening restrictions on immigration. But presidents, one president after another, is frustrated by this, because they're also saying, well, I'm fighting the Cold War. I get your concern about communism, and I want to make room for people fleeing communist regimes. So these laws, don't make sense. But the Cold War is this fascinating period where all of this immigration policy is being forged. And it's this kind of conflict between nativists who care about protecting American jobs, protecting American soil, keeping out the subversives and presidents who really want to, drive foreign policy and say these laws don't help advance our interests overseas.
Now, we're going to turn to questions in just another minute or two. So if you have any questions for Jia Lynn, please click that box at the bottom of your screen and ask your question, and we'll try to get her to answer it for you. Let me ask you this. We're going through another period where immigration restrictionism and anti-refugee sentiment seems to be on the rise. Do you think that your book has some lessons to offer us today in terms of how we think and talk about immigration?
I think for me, when I came into this book, I had heard so much about this idea of a nation of immigrants, right? It's such a powerful mythology. And my book also describes where this whole notion comes from. It's really, I think, from the 50s and helps sort of win the way for the 1965 law. But I think when we embrace that idea so much, we forget just how much the country goes back and forth. So yes, sometimes we embrace immigrants, but more often than not, we're really resistant to them. And I think for right now, I just think to understand what is happening and what's at stake, we have to know the history of how we got here. And the history of how we got here is very complicated because in 65, when they passed laws, I point out, they think they're keeping the country more white by doing family reunification, and yet it leads to totally different demographic changes. They are trying to establish, a foundational principle of racial equality. And that, that's a huge civil rights victory. But the law is kind of unfinished work, right? It kind of allows in all these families. It's really changed the nature of our country. But I think we haven't really grappled with the consequences of the law and also kind of what we want, right? So if we agree with these people that we should not discriminate based on race or ethnicity, what is our criteria? And I just see every day in the news the Trump White House is very clear themselves on what they want to do. You've even seen people like Jeff Sessions, Stephen Miller, criticize the 65 law and say that it went way too far and praise 1924. So in their mind, these are twin poles and they want to go back to 24 and they want to get away from 65. And I just think to understand what's going on now, you have to know that these are the frames of reference for people. And that this idea of us being a nation of immigrants, it's like a dial that can be turned, in different directions. And it depends on people in charge. It depends on politics. And all of these things can be changed, right? So my family was allowed in because of this law, but that wasn't always the case. The laws change and they can be changed again. And I think you really feel how contingent all of these things are once you begin to dig into this history. And it's not a given that anyone's family is going to be here. It all depends on these laws. It all depends on these political struggles, and they are still going on in our midst.
Okay, let's turn to some questions. I've got one here for you, Jia Lynn, from Kevin. What was the most rewarding aspect of writing this book? What was the hardest part?
The most rewarding part was getting to go to tons of libraries. So I'm not a trained historian. I don't have a PhD in history. I studied philosophy in college. I took some history classes at Yale, but I don't come with that. But what was really rewarding to me was that our presidential library system really allows anyone to show up. You don't have to have some kind of special background. Like, these are really places for the American public to go and learn about their country's history. And I would see people, I would meet other historians who were there, but I would also meet sort of average people showing up, just digging through boxes of papers, wanting to learn more. And there's just nothing like, the Library of Congress in Washington, where, all of us are so close to, you can just walk in and get a card and really just access the beauty and wonder of everything in that library. So for me, the most rewarding part was just, getting to access these libraries, meeting wonderful archivists and librarians, and learning just how open and accessible they are. You don't have to get a special pass to do it. If you want to learn about your country's history, it's incredibly accessible. I think the hardest part for me was, my day job is as an editor. So I work at the New York Times now. When I started the book, I was at the Washington Post. And there's been a lot of news these last couple of years. So juggling my day job and the book has been really, was really tough, but also really rewarding, because while I was going through archives of, old issues of the New York Times and the Washington Post, I was at the same time editing stories for these publications. And that's just a tremendous honor. One moment that it sticks in my mind that was really kind of funny and fascinating was I was one Saturday at the Library of Congress, going through Manny Seller's papers, learning about him fighting for more refugees to come into the country. And I was editing national security stories for the Post, and there was a bombing in Syria, and I suddenly had to hop off that story, hop off my research and start editing stories about that and the refugee crisis in the Middle East. And it was just, that it was hard to do both, but for me, just so interesting to see all the connections between history and our present.
So we're answering questions, or Jia Lynn's answering your questions at this moment. So if you've got a question for her, write it in the box down below. Here's one that's, I think, right up your alley. It's about Asian American identity. And let me see, it looks like Susie wants to know if you have a view about when this notion of Asian American as a cohesive social and political identity may have arose. And then as part of the question, she's wondering whether you see it this way, that captures a diverse and largely fractured ethnic group, given all the economic disparities and the different places where people have come from.
Yeah, I think Asian American is just this really fraught, really tenuous, fascinating term. From my understanding, it comes out of really activist movements in the 60s and 70s, where people are trying to sort of say, like, we need political power and we need grassroots power, and we're modeling ourselves after the Black Civil Rights Movement, and we need to create this category of people called Asian Americans. I would also say that our immigration laws in the past are creating that category too. Lawmakers are sort of drawing, there are these crazy maps that they're drawing saying, okay, this is like the Asia Triangle, we can only allow so many people. So they're always kind of creating this racial category too. And all of us who are Asian American kind of inherit these categories, but then have to live them out every day. And I think one of the things that is challenging about this category is that 2/3 of Asian Americans in this country now are foreign born. And so there are always Asian Americans coming, and they're coming from obviously all over this, I don't have to tell, like, wildly diverse continent. We are still kind of figuring out what our place is here. I think the 65 law for me is so significant because it says how, for people like me, people who are the children of immigrants who are here thanks to the law, we are very new here. We're just very new. There have been Asian Americans in this country for many, many years, obviously. But this volume, this kind of cohort of people coming from post-65, it's a whole new territory. And so what it means to be Asian American, or what it means to be Chinese American or Taiwanese American or Korean American, we're all kind of figuring that in real time. I think doing this book made me understand very clearly there is not some sort of clear identity that someone's packaged and put in a bow that they're going to hand to me and I'm going to feel like, oh, someone's figured it out for me and here it is. It's very much in flux. And I think because of this law and the way that it created just these kind of unanticipated demographic changes, that means there's all this work that hasn't really been done to define, who Asian Americans are and why we're here. Right. So if Stephen Miller says, well, you're not supposed to be here, the law wasn't supposed to allow you to be here, like, what is the retort? What does the community say to that? What is our vision of what it means to be American that would include us? And I think that is still very much in debate. It's very live right now, given what the Trump administration is trying to do. I don't have easy answers. I mean, I came away from this even thinking like, so my family was allowed here, but should we have been allowed here over and above somebody else with different needs? So I feel like I tried to explain how we got here, but kind of where we go next, it's very hard to say. And I think all these questions about, do you prioritize families? Do you prioritize job skills? All of that is up in the air. And I think for Asian Americans, it's important to know this history because this is how we got here.
Okay, here's a good one from Leslie. Do you think that assimilation is a racist ideology and has to be confronted that way? I'm paraphrasing as well. And here's another part of the question. From your perspective, what does the metaphorical symphony look like, in case you embrace that, as an alternative to the melting pot?
I don't know. I think these are questions that I think we all have to kind of discuss together. I think about my own family and, how we found a place here. And, I'm from Fairfax County, Northern Virginia. I took for granted that, so many of my friends growing up, their parents were immigrants. They were from around the world. And for me, like, Fairfax County is kind of, for me, like a very special place, because it was a place where people from around the world sort of came together, raised their families together. There's all kinds of food, there's all kinds of culture, all kinds of languages being spoken. If you go to, I'm down the street from basically Koreatown in Annandale. If you go there, they're not just Koreans, people from around the world. And, I don't have some big theory as to what it means to assimilate or what it means to be American, but I look to my own childhood as a bit of a touchstone for how we can live together with this much racial diversity and sort of learn from each other and benefit from each other and have this kind of very, in my mind, at least for me, largely very harmonious way of experiencing lots of different cultures without ever having to get on a plane. Northern Virginia, for all of you, I'm sure you all know, the whole DC area is just wildly diverse. And I think I took that for granted. I think this area is different from other places. When I've, as I've grown older and go to other places, I realize how special Northern Virginia is in that way. So I don't know. And I feel like my family found a way to be here. And this state, Virginia, right, which used to be capital of the Confederacy, somehow has changed in a way to really welcome families like mine, people from around the country, and the state has transformed enormously in my lifetime. And so to me, what is the model, how to do it? I'm not sure, but one of the kind of emotional touchstones, and in a way, my book is kind of an homage to that way that I grew up. So I don't know, I look to Virginia weirdly as one way to think about it.
So, Jia Lynn, I heard you say Annandale, and so I'm going to assert conversation partner's privilege and ask you, is there still Korean barbecue over there at the moment?
We have not explored. We did go to Mama Chang's, which is an amazing Chinese restaurant in Fairfax next to a Home Depot, which is like classic Northern Virginia. Like the best Asian food is like in the weirdest places. We have not explored Bonchon, but if anyone knows, I'd be very eager to know.
All right, write in if you live in the area and you know whether Korean barbecue still exists. Here's a question that's sort of connected from Andrew. How do you think COVID will affect immigration law?
It already is. So, Stephen Miller has said, the Times has reported this, that from the beginning of this administration, they thought about a public health crisis as potentially a way to do what they want with immigration and what they've wanted to do all along, with or without a pandemic. And so they've suspended family-based immigration. So this family reunification thing, they've suspended for 60 days. They're really using this as a moment to advance those interests. And I might add that, this is a moment, I think, of rising xenophobia in this country and around the world. We've seen horrific anti-African racism in China. We've seen terrible rising anti-Asian racism in this country. And I do think, my reading of history is that when there is social chaos, when there's economic crisis, when the fabric of society doesn't feel like it's quite holding together, that is really fertile ground for xenophobia. And I fear that is kind of where we're headed right now. And I think the anti-Asian attacks in this country show you that already. I think that'll happen probably in Europe as well. This is just a very, scary, uncertain time. And so I do think that if there is rising xenophobia, as I fear might happen, that really creates an opening for anti-immigration laws. And again, I don't know what our immigration laws should look like, but I think for someone who wants to argue for more restrictions, in a moment of greater xenophobia, people are more receptive to changing immigration and limiting it.
It does seem like the emergency situation has created some opportunities for restrictionists, and many of them are seizing it. Here's one that's along the same lines, actually a hard question, a philosophical one from Jia.
Hit me.
Did researching it and writing this book make you more or less optimistic about America's future?
I felt up and down as I was writing it. There were dark moments. I mean, it is hard to write about, when you think about immigration law and the Holocaust, for instance, which I had to think about, it's really painful to think about what happens when a government overnight revokes your papers. right? Like you're going around your business, your family's been here for a while, you feel like you've assimilated, you fit in, and then the government really can, I mean, these are just papers. The government really can revoke them and say, you know, you're not a citizen anymore, or, you know, you've got to be deported. These laws are always in flux. And so that dark side for me, I think by learning how tenuous these laws are and where they come from, I began to imagine a world in which they hadn't been passed and that they can be changed. And so in that way, it felt dark, right? To consider that I have birthright citizenship, but that is, again, a piece of paper and someone can always change the rules. That said, I think I came away with more optimism too, because I think when you understand where we come from and what fights were waged over all these years, and that people spent 40 years trying to remove laws from the books that were explicitly racist, and still won. And they passed this law, but you know, they won, first of all, because they persevered, but there's also a lot of unfinished work here. I mean, I haven't even mentioned one of the really strange things about the law is that it adds numerical restrictions on immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time. So overnight, it helps while creating, you know, trying to create a level playing field on race and immigration, it inadvertently creates a whole new category of illegal immigration. And historian May Nye has done terrific work on this, but like, it's a complicated law. There are ways in which it is a civil rights triumph in a way, but it also creates all these inadvertent consequences. So I think for me, I ultimately come away optimistic because it feels empowering to know the history, to know that we can't just sort of sit and assume that like, this gauzy idea of a nation of immigrants is sort of self-sustaining and will always be here. It's a thing that people have had to fight for. It can be changed, but if it's something that we want as a country, it's a thing that people have to fight for, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think these things are not on autopilot. And I think the conservative movement has really seized on that. They understand that you can change the rules of the game. I think when I hear liberals and Democrats talk about this, there's a lot of kind of like, but they can't do that. You know, they can't, it's a nation of immigrants. They can't do that, but they can, you know, and the country has done it before. It can do it again. It can, you know, it's a political fight. It always is going on. It never, ever stops. And so I think you could take that as sort of a depressing thought, but to me, that's an opportunity to talk about what kind of country we want. And, you know, I don't pretend at the end of the book to have the answers for how to do this. I think it's really hard. I don't know if a family like mine should have been admitted, you know, after 1965. Were we the highest priority or should someone else have come in? But I think it's a chance to actually talk about it. You know, we have all these undocumented people in our midst. They are working at meat packing plants, as we're learning, under horrific conditions. This is not a sustainable situation. And so this country, I think, is overdue for a big discussion about what it means to be American. You know, those who want open borders can argue for that. Those who don't need to hash out how we decide who comes in and who doesn't. But this couldn't be a more fundamental subject for us all to talk about, and not in slogans, but in this really, you know, in a way to dig deep and to think about our own families and how we got here, and to ask kind of hard questions about, you know, how we make these selections.
We have some breaking news. We've been told that Korean barbecue, in fact, does still exist in Annandale. Yes. We have two people who've said this, so that's great. Cause for celebration. We have time to do one more question, and here's the question. Now it's going to force you to really, you know, rack your brain. You talk about so much that's happened between 1924 and 65, and Anil wants to know whether you think there is one particular moment or experience between 24 and 65 that stands out in particular to you, as important for people to know about today.
That is such a good question. I think there's so many. For me, one story that sticks out, I'll just share. It's towards the beginning of my book because this person, I just can't stop thinking about his story. His name is Takao Ozawa, and he is a Japanese immigrant in Hawaii. And this is the 1920s, and he has been in this country for years and years and years. He comes when he's 18 or 19. He gets to California for college, and he just loves the US. And he moves to Hawaii and marries a Japanese woman. They have children. He's working for a sugar company, and he is ready to be an American citizen. He's really like, if my country goes to war with the US, I'm fighting for the US. I will die for this country. And so he shows up in a Honolulu clerk's office and says, I'm here to naturalize. I want to be an American. And they don't know what to do with him because at this point in the 1920s, this naturalization law says you got to be a free white or free, or African-American to be an American citizen. You're Asian, like we don't know what to do with you. And he isn't a lawyer. He's not legally trained. He doesn't even hire a lawyer at first, but he begins to go through the courts to argue his case. And he writes these tremendously moving legal briefs. I mean, I don't know if they're, I'm not a lawyer. I don't think they're technically, but he just writes why he believes that he should be American. And he says, I don't look like an American, but at heart, I am a true American. And I want to be part of this country. And he talks about assimilation. He says, my kids don't even speak Japanese. We only speak English. I don't register my family with the Japanese government, even though that's what we're supposed to do. We don't even hang out with their Japanese families. Like, we are all in on America. And his fight goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And this case is fascinating for me because you can imagine these Supreme Court justices in the early 1920s. And really, for all the legal arguments, they're just being asked to assess if this Japanese man sitting in front of them is white or not, and these are white justices all in a row. And basically and he tries, and Takazawa was like, well, I'm really pale. Maybe that makes me white. If you do like a map of hereditariness and Caucasians, there's a connection to Japanese people. And the justices basically say, you know what? We get that you want to be American. You seem to have what it takes, but you're not white. You're not American. You can't naturalize. And I just really, and he dies a Japanese citizen. He never is allowed to naturalize. He has a son who's American born, who goes to fight in World War II, dies in Italy. And I just think about that family and that man, because I think the questions that he was trying to ask are so fundamental to how we imagine ourselves. The questions that those justices were trying to confront, that he was trying to confront of, okay, what does it mean to be American? Is it about your ethnicity, or is it about something deeper that's something in your heart? And so for me, that story is just one that is, that has just remained with me, and I think is really worth thinking about for us right now.
Well, on that note, thanks so much for joining us for a wonderful conversation about Jia Lynn's book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. Here it is. Hit that little green button at the bottom of your screen. Order it if you haven't already done so. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. It was an honor to be here, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Before we go, I just have one last question. What are you both reading, and do you have any recommendations?
Robert, do you want to go ahead?
I'm reading and rereading a wonderful book called The Chinese Must Go by legal historian Beth Lou Williams. And it talks about this period in the late 19th century when over 168 communities in the American West expelled all Chinese migrants from their midst. It's a chilling book, but one that I think is also dovetails with your book. But that's one of the books that's on the top of my list right now.
I'm reading Days of Distraction, which is a new novel from a debut author named Alexandra Chang. And it's really terrific. It's about a Chinese American woman. I very much relate to this book. It's about a Chinese American woman who in her 20s is a business journalist, which I also was. And it's written in this really kind of formally daring way, but it's just really beautiful and I can't put it down.
Thank you so much. I'll have to check out both of those books. They sound really good. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for everyone who attended. You can buy Jia Lynn Yang's book down below and Robert's book in the Ask a Question box. Thank you all for being here tonight. Stay well read, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.